amazing. Now, we're going to start a new series this morning, and we want to address what's going on in our nation right now, especially around the cost of living crisis. And so we are starting a series called Favour in Famine. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the challenging things that we're going through as a nation, and how biblically and scripturally we respond as Christians. And also to encourage people that even in difficult times, there is God's favour. And so we're going to be starting that this morning and then building up over the next few weeks. And then actually on the 28th, on Pentecost Sunday, we're going to conclude that series, and we've got a guest speaker to celebrate Pentecost Sunday, and that's Wesley Vaughan, who's the pastor over at Trinity Church. He's going to be coming and preaching here on that particular Sunday. But this morning, I want you to welcome, as part of our leadership team, Thomas Halley, who's going to come and start our series. Let's put our hands together, and let's give a really, really good warm welcome to Thomas, who's speaking this morning. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thanks, Peter. Good morning, everyone. And you can hear okay? Good. So, favour in famine, God's plan. Now, some of you will remember a young man by the name of Ben Carman. Hands up if you remember Ben Carman. He was the youth pastor at this church for many years, and he used to come to the planning meetings when we were planning a series of preaching. And I used to attend those meetings, and there's one thing that Ben said in those meetings that I'll never forget, and now I'm going to tell you, and maybe you'll never forget. He said, when you're preaching, just say one thing. I know we talk sometimes for half an hour, even longer, but he said, make sure you've got one point, and then keep saying it again and again and again, go round about it and use different examples, but just have one point, because people are only going to remember one thing. Okay. No, I haven't forgotten what I'm going to say. I'm going to do something unusual. Can I ask, please? I'm really sorry about this. Can I ask somebody to help me? That light's really bright in my eyes. Is it possible to make it a bit less bright? I'm really sorry about that. This is my eyes. They just struggle with bright lights. Thank you so much. So the one thing that I'm going to say is not about the bright lights. It is about when God shows favour in famine. It is part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. If you're somebody who makes notes, write that down now. If you don't make notes, but you've got a camera on your phone, take a picture of that now. And that's all I'm going to say. You can go now. Thanks, Tyler. That's brilliant. It's a little bit better. Thank you. So that's what I'm going to be saying. When God shows favour in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. Yeah, you can go home. No, you don't have to go home. I'd like to go round and about that point, and on the way to doing it, I've got 3 questions I'd like to ask. What is famine? What does the Bible say about famine? And what's the purpose of famine? Okay, what is famine? It's an extreme lack of food, and there's many causes for that. Some of them include war. Okay, war can cause famine, and sometimes weather. By that I mean extreme weather events like drought, flood, maybe other natural disasters as well. If you put those two together, war and terrible weather, you can end up with crop failure. Okay, the crops don't grow, so people don't have enough to eat. That's famine, and there's consequences. You've probably seen these on TV screens. There's malnutrition, not getting enough of the right nutrition from your food. There's disease and death, and nobody wants that for their family. So many people, to try and get away from that situation, they move. We have migration. People move to other parts of their own country or maybe to other parts of the world. So even if you've never experienced famine yourself, the chances are you may have met somebody who's come to where you live, near where you live, wherever that is, because of famine or the fear of famine. So that's famine. But what about a cost of living crisis? That's where the issue we're trying to address in this series. Is that the same as famine? Well, some people might say yes, because there's people today in this country and other countries in the world who are struggling to get enough food to eat. On the other hand, there's people who've lived through extreme famines in different places in the world. They might look at a country like the United Kingdom and say, well, no, you can't call that famine because people still eat and the standard of living is generally higher. So we could debate that. Maybe it is famine, maybe it isn't. But there are similarities, and there's similarities in the causes. The war in the Ukraine is one of the factors that has affected the cost of living in this country. Also, we've got political decisions that have been made. And sometimes after the politicians make a decision, then the bankers or the stockbrokers or people in the stock market, they make decisions. And that, even though I don't understand it all, that affects our cost of living. Then there's COVID. 3 years ago, the government had to pay people to sit at home because we were told we can't work in certain jobs. And I'm sure that has affected the amount of money that the government has now. So all of these and other factors have contributed to our cost of living crisis, and there are consequences. There may be some people here who think, well, that's okay, my income is quite high, I'm not really affected by the cost of living crisis. Well, you are affected because we have strikes. First it was the train drivers, then the teachers, and the nurses, doctors, so many people on strike. It affects all of us. Then we have debt, people getting into debt, and people becoming victims of poverty. All of these are happening. So whether you call it famine or not, there are some similarities. But there's another type of famine. And that is, in the Bible, a spiritual famine. And this is written about in the book of Amos. It's a lack of words from God. Amos chapter 8 says this: "The days are coming, declares the sovereign Lord, when I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of food or a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. People will stagger from sea to sea and wander from north to east, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it." So we've got extreme lack of food, we've got cost of living crisis, and we've got spiritual famine. Different levels of famine. So, second question, what does the Bible say about famine? There's actually a lot there, more than what I imagined. I was thinking of talking on Joseph just in this talk, but I saw so much. I'm not going to talk about Joseph alone. There's lots. I'm going to focus on the New Testament. No, get it right. Old Testament this week. And there's 6, 7, 8 characters from the Old Testament I'm going to mention who all went through famine. And God had favor on these people in the time of famine. That's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, Ruth, Elijah, and Elisha. Are you ready? I'm going to go really fast. You're going to have to check these out for yourself if you have time when you are home. Genesis chapter 12 is the first mention of famine in the Bible. And Genesis chapter 12 is also a really, really important foundational part of the Bible because it's the call of Abraham. Abraham originally was called Abram. His name was later changed to Abraham. Let's have a read of Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This is the gospel. This is the good news. All people on earth will be blessed through Abraham's descendants. And let's put this in context so you can see what we're talking about. It starts off in you are. That is where Abraham was born. That's modern-day Iraq. Then the first step of his journey was over to Haran, which is modern-day Syria. And then the final step was down to the land of Canaan. It was called Canaan then, now it's called Israel. And he wandered around to bits of Egypt as well. So Abraham went to all these places, and the reason this is significant and linked to our topic today is because not long after he arrived in the land that was promised to him, there was a famine. And God showed him favor in the famine. He didn't die of hunger, he survived. And then his son Isaac was born. Isaac also experienced a famine. And once again, God showed favor of him. He didn't die. In fact, there was a miraculous way God provided for Isaac during a famine. And then Isaac had a son called Jacob. Guess what? Again, another famine. And this time, it was worse. Now, just so you have an idea, this was roughly Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, roughly 2100 to 1900 BC. All dates are approximate. Jacob's famine was worse because it affected people in other places. And the solution to Jacob's famine was actually in his own family. His own son, Joseph, was conveniently prime minister of Egypt. It's a long story. You can read it for yourself in the book of Genesis. But in roughly 1875 BC, Jacob went to Egypt to get food. And the food was provided for him by his son, Joseph, who was now prime minister of Egypt. So that means Jacob and his family had moved. They were in Egypt. Jacob's name was actually changed to Israel. So from now on, I'm going to talk about the people of Israel, and we're talking about Jacob's family. And in Israel, after 400 years or so, they became slaves. God called a man called Moses to rescue the slaves from the Israelite slaves, to rescue them out of Egypt. And this happened in the book of Exodus. You can read the story. And they wandered around in the desert of the Sinai Peninsula. There it is, around there. And that's a desert. You can't grow things there. So guess what? They were hungry. They were starving. But God provided miraculously. We'll see more of that later. Fast forward another 300 years, 1100 BC. Now we've got the story of Ruth. I love the story of Ruth. It starts with a woman named Naomi. Naomi lived in Bethlehem. And there was a famine in Bethlehem. So Naomi moved to Moab, the neighboring country. Things got worse. Her husband died. Her 2 sons died. In the end, the famine in Bethlehem stopped. So she went back home and she took with her one of her daughters-in-law called Ruth back to Bethlehem. And then Ruth, because they had nothing to eat, Ruth went into a field to pick grain from the leftovers at the harvest time. The field belonged to a man named Boaz. To cut a long story short, Boaz, a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, married Ruth. And God showed favor to this family that had been in all sorts of trouble because of famine. Fast forward again, another 200 years in Israel, we've got a prophet named Elijah. Elijah gave a message from God and said, there's going to be no rain for 3 years. There's no rain, there's a famine. And God showed favor to Elijah during the famine in miraculous ways. We'll come back to those. Also, Elijah's successor, Elisha, went through another famine. God showed favor to Elisha. More details to come about how God provided miraculously for Elisha. So we've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, Ruth, Elijah, Elisha. All these stories about God's favor in famine are pointing somewhere. In fact, they're pointing to someone. I'll reveal the identity of that person a little bit later. But now on to our third question. This is the most important question. Why? What is the purpose of famine? Or what is the purpose of God showing favour in famine to these particular people? Why didn't he show favour in famine to everybody in the whole world? Let's try and answer this question. Firstly, a reason for God showing favour to specific people in famine is to preserve a family tree. Now, yesterday when the coronation was happening, we saw evidence of a family tree continuing. You may not be aware of it, but this coronation was not a thing that was dreamed up just a few years ago. It's actually following a long line of coronations because Charles III, of course, he's the son of Elizabeth II, and then if you go back for over 900 years, there's an unbroken line of kings and queens. That's the royal family tree. That's a big deal to Charles and his family. Whatever your views of the royal family, that's their history. Did you know there's a royal family tree in the Bible? A royal family tree in the Bible. Let's have a look at it. It starts with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You can read it in Matthew chapter 1. I've left out a few, that's why I've got dotted lines. Boaz and Ruth are in this family tree. Boaz and Ruth were the great-grandparents of King David, the greatest ever king of Israel. So this is, that's the whole point of the Bible. It's the Old Testament is the family tree of the royal family of Israel. King David had sons. His son Solomon was king. Then there were a whole load of other kings, some good, some bad. Eventually, after 28 generations, you get Jesus. So the royal family of Israel is Jesus' family. That is the whole point of the Old Testament. It's God's rescue plan for the human race. God started off with Abraham. He picked one man. From one man, he created a nation, the nation of Israel. From that nation came one man, Jesus, who died on the cross so that we could be forgiven, who rose again, proving that he was the Son of God. That is God's rescue plan. And it's the family tree of Jesus. So when we ask the question, why did God show favour on these particular people in famines and not on others, we can see that God was in the process of getting the right people in the right places so that Jesus could be born. When God shows favour in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. Let's move on. A second reason for us, a second purpose for famine is it's a wake-up call. Let's have a look. We're going back to Moses now. Moses said these words just before taking the people to the edge of the promised land. He was talking and saying about the consequences of obeying God. First of all, he said, if you obey God, God will bless you. You'll be prosperous, you'll live in peace, and you'll be healthy. But this is where it gets difficult. Deuteronomy 28 verse 15. However, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I'm giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. And then he lists a number of terrible things that will happen to the people, like war and so on. Then, as we move on to verse 22, the Lord will strike you with wasting disease, with fever and inflammation, with scorching heat and drought, with blight and mildew, which will plague you until you perish. The sky over your head will be bronze, the ground beneath you iron. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust and powder. It will come down from the skies until you are destroyed. And we know what happens when there's no rain. The crops don't grow, famine. So God is actually saying famine will be a consequence of the people of Israel not obeying God. Now, we need to be a little bit careful here. We mustn't say, oh, today, let's look at the United Kingdom. There's a cost of living crisis. So that's because the government has abandoned God, or that's because the king has abandoned God. No, it doesn't work like that. And the problem is, or the reason is, because no country on earth is a theocracy. Oh, not long words. Why is he using long words? Okay, bear with me. Theocracy. It's not that hard. You may have heard of the word democracy. That means that people vote for their rulers. Okay? The United Kingdom is a democracy. A theocracy comes from the Greek word theos. Theos is a Greek word for God. So a theocracy means God is the king of that country. And the ancient kingdom of Israel was a theocracy. God was their king. God had the right to say, these are your rules. If you obey these rules, I'll bless you. If you disobey them, there's going to be bad consequences. And that was okay for the people because they knew the rules. But what we can't do is say, let's apply that to countries today. We can't look at a country in the world that's experiencing famine, and let's say, oh, it's because their government is corrupt, or it's because their leaders don't worship God. No, it doesn't work like that. You can't transfer political points from the Old Testament to every single government in this country, because there are all sorts of causes of modern famine. They're complex. Sometimes there's a famine because one country has blocked off the river, put a dam in, and that's stopped water flowing into the next country. So it's not the fault of that country, another country's caused it. That could be true also for wars and all sorts of other reasons, maybe even climate change, where you've got things that people do in rich countries that pump out loads of fumes and change the climate, and it's people in other countries who are not pumping out fumes, they are the ones who suffer. So let's be careful we don't misapply the Old Testament to our modern countries. But having said that, don't throw out the Old Testament, because there is so much beautiful things we can learn from that. There's spiritual lessons. So spiritual famine may be a wake-up call to us. Spiritual famine means we can't hear the words from God. If that's happening to us, I would encourage us to ask these questions, whether it's personal life or as a large group of people. If we can't hear what God is saying, maybe we could ask ourselves, is there any disobedience in our lives? That could be a wake-up call for us to turn back to God. When God shows favour in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. And the people of Israel sometimes needed wake-up calls so they could get back on track, being a blessing to the nations around them. Third thing I want to talk about, famine can be an opportunity to point to Christ. Let's go back to Elijah in the Old Testament, one of the prophets. There was a famine in his time. It's amazing how God provided for him. Can you believe it? God actually told ravens to feed him. It almost doesn't make sense. How could a raven come and bring food to a human being? And also, you may be wondering, how do they stage this photo? I've no idea. But that's what the Bible says. Elijah was fed by ravens. And then the next miracle was even more incredible. Elijah went to a place outside Israel. Zarephath is in modern-day Lebanon. And when he was there, he met a widow. And this widow she thought she was going to die because she'd run out of food because of the famine. All she had was a jar of flour and a jug of oil. And Elijah said to her, "You're not going to run out of flour or oil until it starts raining again." And it happened. This was a miraculous multiplication of food. There was enough flour and oil for the next 3 years to for her to eat and for Elijah to eat. Favour in famine. And then Elisha, how did God provide for him? These were even more amazing miracles. There was trouble finding enough to eat, so they were hunting around, and all they could find was this vegetable called a gourd, Gourd. If you're not familiar with gourds, they're a bit like the pumpkin family, okay, that sort of shape, or maybe like squash, that kind of thing. So they picked them up, put them in a stew, and the people didn't know what it was. They started eating, and ugh, it's disgusting. People were crying out. They thought it was poisonous. It tasted awful. They said, there's death in the pot. Elisha took some flour, threw it in the pot, and the food became edible. People ate it, and they didn't starve to death. Then the next miracle from Elisha, same famine, Elisha had to feed 100 people. And all he had was 20 loaves of bread. But God multiplied the food so that there was enough to eat. And leftovers. Does any of this sound a bit familiar? Jesus did very similar things. With 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus fed 5,000 Jewish people. On another separate occasion, with 7 loaves and a few small fish, Jesus fed 4,000 non-Jewish people. Multiplication of food. Elijah did it, Elisha did it. It was all pointing forward to Jesus. And Jesus did this to show that he is the bread of life. He is the one who supplies all our spiritual needs. When God shows favour in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. Where are we going? Now, the next thing I'd like to say, how are we doing? We got time? Can we keep going? This is even more important. I thought about, it's gone on a bit long. We might stop here. But no, I think this is the last thing I want to say. It's something from the Old Testament again, and it covers 3 different Bible passages, but it's the same issue. And it's from the time of Moses. Okay, back to the story of Moses, who brought the people out of Israel. When they came out and they were in the desert wandering around, there was no food. The people were hungry and they were angry. I know a new word has been invented. You put them together. Hangry. Well, whether or not you like that word, these people were seriously complaining. They were saying, why did you bring us here to die in the desert? Surely it'd be better to go back to Egypt. I know we were slaves there, but at least we got food. They'd had enough. They were complaining against Moses. And this is what happened next. It's in Exodus chapter 16. The Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. And then verse 31, the people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white, like coriander seed, and tasted like wafers made with honey. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. So this was miraculous food from God. When God shows favour in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. There we go. You see, God didn't want them to die in the desert. He had a plan to bring the people of Israel to the promised land so that they could be a blessing to the nations. But there's more in the story of manna. Let's carry on. This now is in Deuteronomy chapter 8, again, just before the people enter the promised land. And Moses is reflecting on what happened in the wilderness over the last 40 years. Deuteronomy 8. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you. Sorry, that's wrong. Yeah, he humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you. What did he want to teach them? To teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Have you heard that before? Jesus said it when he was tempted in the wilderness. Man does not live on bread alone. The point Jesus is making is that physical hunger is a bad thing, of course. But there's something worse than physical hunger, and that is spiritual hunger. Physical hunger is a terrible thing when there's no rain, when people can't eat, and they're at risk of dying. But something is even worse when people, millions of people, just in this country alone, don't know who God is. They don't know the forgiveness that they can have in Jesus. They don't know that they can be a new creation. There's spiritual hunger, and that's millions of people in this country. Across the world, there's hundreds of millions of people in spiritual hunger, and they need to know. They need to know that God can show them favor in famine as part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. Now, the story of manna is completed in the book of Joshua. Moses died before entering the promised land. His successor was Joshua, and this is what happened just after, not long at all after Joshua had brought the people of Israel into the promised land. Joshua chapter 5. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated the Passover. Then, the day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites, but that year they ate the produce of Canaan. What's this all about? What can we learn from this? I believe that God is the God who provides. God is the God who provides, but he does it in different ways. Sometimes he does it in a miraculous way, bread from heaven. But other times, he says, go and feed yourself. When the Israelites got into the land, it was a fertile land. They didn't need a daily miracle from God. They needed to plant the seed, grow the crops, do the harvest. And I believe this is a challenge for us today. When we're praying to God, sometimes we pray for miracles because we know that's the only way it can happen. But other times, we may be part of the answer to our prayer. Part of the answer to our prayer may be something that we do to provide for ourselves or to provide for other people. And this is a challenge to us. There may be someone here who's really struggling financially, and you'd love to have £1 million just drop through your letterbox. And God sometimes does things like that. But other times, God does miracles over a period of time, and part of the answer to the prayer is us using our gifts and skills in working, earning money, providing for ourselves, so that we can do the shopping and we can feed ourselves. So God provides, but he does it in many different ways. So what's the purpose of famine? What's the purpose of God showing favor to these 8 people? It's pointing, I think you know the answer. It's pointing to Jesus. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Ruth, in the family tree of Jesus. Moses and Joshua received manna from heaven, pointing to Jesus, the bread of life, who gives us everything we need. Elijah and Elisha multiplied food, just as Jesus did. Jesus, the one who's the Son of God, able to have control over nature. When God shows favor in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. Favour. There are times when we pray for God's favour. God, help me out. I need your help. I need a miracle. And that's okay to pray like that. Jesus said, pray, give us today our daily bread. It's okay to pray for ourselves. But there's a danger. If we only pray for ourselves, then our prayers can be me, me, me. God, show me favour. God, help me. God, help me out. I need more money. God, help me out. I need this. Oh, God, I've got a problem. Help me. Me, 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 me. And if we're praying like that, we need a balance. Jesus said, give us today our daily bread. But first he said, Father in heaven, may your kingdom come. May your name be honoured. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as in heaven. So our prayers should also be not just about me, but be about them. And who's the them? The nations. When God shows favour in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. And we are part of God's rescue plan. We don't come to church just for me, because I've got a need, I need help. That may be one of the reasons, but once we're here as a community, we are part of the rescue plan for the world. It started off with Abraham. From one man, it came to a nation of Israel. From that nation of Israel came Jesus. Jesus died and rose again. And then he said to his disciples, go and make disciples of all nations and teach them to obey everything I taught you. That's for us. We are disciples of Jesus. It's part of our role to be a blessing to the nations. Teaching them, helping them to grow as disciples. When God shows favour in famine, it's part of a bigger plan to bring blessing to the nations. So how do we respond to this message? I want to encourage us to respond as we sing the next song, which Dawn's going to lead us in a short while. The words of this song include these words: all of my life, in every season, you are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. So I want to encourage us to thank God. Let's thank God for the favour he's shown us in forgiving us. Whatever our situation is, God is still good. He loves us. And we can thank him. We've got a reason to thank him. And we can do that this morning. Also, I want to encourage us to respond in trust. We can trust God. Even if we can't see the answer. You may be going through a terrible situation. I don't know who's listening today. There's people online listening, could be anywhere in the world. Maybe you can't see the way out of your problem. You can't see how you're going to get the finances for what you need. Let's trust God. He is the God who provides. We may not know how he's going to provide. It might not be in one day. It might take a while. But God is the God who provides. So let's trust him and let's declare our trust in him as we sing this song. And the next way of responding is not just about this song, it's our lives. Let's be people who give. Let's thank God. Let's trust him. And let's be people who give our time to help to make disciples. People who give our money. There may be somebody who's struggling more than we are with the cost of living crisis. Let's thank God. Let's trust God. And let's be people who give, because God is a God who provides.